But right away, I want to get some reaction first from, while we wait for the minister, from the opposition. First, John Brassard is the Conservatives' House Leader. He's with us right now, and so is Allastair MacGregor. He's the NDP's public safety critic. Hello. Thank you very much for your patience. I know you listened in to that press conference along with our audience, so I know they're anxious to get your reaction. I'll start with you, Mr. Brassard. I know that your party has, in the past, through some of the legislation the Liberals have already announced, criticized it for being too punitive on people who are lawful owners of guns. I heard the Prime Minister and a number of ministers in this announcement, this press conference tonight, acknowledge that the vast majority of people who own guns do so lawfully and responsibly. The Prime Minister said there's no reason to have a gun, though, unless you're involved in sport shooting or hunting. Is he right?
Well, Vasi, I listened in on the press conference like you did, and I'm sure that criminals and gang members are shaking in their boots tonight. The real problem in this country is not the law-abiding firearms owners who are heavily regulated, heavily licensed, have to go through a rigorous screening system in order to obtain a firearm. The real problem in this country has to do with gangs and criminals who are importing firearms, mostly from the United States, using illegal guns on our streets. And, look, we've seen over the last 7 years an increase since the Liberals have been in power, an increase in gun crime, illegal gun crime in Canada's most major cities. Toronto this year, we've seen 147 shootings. Out west, we've seen an increase in Vancouver and Montreal. These are brazen use of firearms by illegal gangs and criminals. And that is the root cause of the gun problem in this country. And that's the thing that the government needs to focus on and address.
Let me just follow up for a second, Mr. Brassard. Can you kind of walk and chew gum? Can they walk and chew gum at the same time? By that, I mean, look, they said we've increased funding to the RCMP and CBSA. As a result, we've seen a doubling of the number of guns seized at the border in the last year, in this year over last year. At the same time, we don't want to see the level of handguns in this country increase, because in many instances, in other jurisdictions, you do see a higher level of gun crimes with a higher level of guns, period. Can you not freeze handguns and tackle things at the border and thereby, have a better, bigger impact?
Well, I mean, it's clearly that's what the government is signaling today. The minister and the prime minister signaled that. But, it's important to understand that all publicly owned handguns in Canada are highly restricted and limited to just firing ranges. And it requires a license. And, oftentimes the politics are that the government will cite what goes on in the United States. We are not the United States. You can't just simply walk into a gun store like you can in the United States and walk out with a gun. You have to go through a rigorous system of checks and processes in order to purchase a gun. But I go back to what I said earlier, Vasi, and to your point, the illegal importation of handguns by gangs and criminal elements are the root cause of the problem. And when you talk about walking and chewing gum at the same time, the government wants to deal with this problem. But when you look at, for example, the legislation imposed in C5, they're actually proposing to restrict or limit the sentences for gun use in the commission of a crime. So walking and chewing gum, on one hand, they say we want to tackle the problem, but they're not really tackling the problem. And on the other hand, they're looking, at the judicial system right now and saying, well, you know what, if you use a gun in the commission of the crime, we're going to reduce the sentence or leave it up to the judge to determine what that sentence might be. Listen, anybody that uses a gun, mostly, as I said, gangs and criminal elements who use a gun in the commission of the crime should be paying a price. But again, the root cause is the illegal importation of guns by criminals and gangs. That's the root of the problem. So the resources are great. I know that the CBSA has increased their resources. They have confiscated a lot more guns, but it's not going to solve the problem. We're still going to be dealing with it. And the illegal gun and importation of illegal guns is the problem.
Okay, I do have a follow-up question. I think you're referring to and I want to get Mr. MacGregor in right now, but I think you're referring to the sort of the Liberals getting rid of mandatory minimums, which they had pledged to do because of a whole host of other reasons. I take your point about gun offenses and the reduction in sentences there, but part of the justification for that was because those mandatory minimums were hitting minority communities disproportionately. That's a whole other discussion, but I do want to make that point. I got to get Mr. MacGregor in. I'll go right back to you.
But if you commit a crime with a gun, please come back to me because I will address that.
I will, I promise. I do understand the point you're making. I just want to make sure that the full story is out there. Mr. MacGregor, is your party in support of this freeze, or would you like to see a full ban? I read through a number of your party's releases, and I looked through the last campaign platform, and I couldn't find a very clear position.
No, what our position has been clearly stated in several election campaigns now. I mean, it goes all the way back to when Jack Layton was our leader. He, in fact, was the first leader who proposed allowing municipalities to put in a ban, and that's been expanded to helping provinces and territories. And our position is that, now it's May. We've had quite a lot of time already passed by in this 44th Parliament. What the government should be doing now is working with provinces and working with municipalities to help those jurisdictions that do want to ban a handgun. We have legislation before us. I mean, it's only about an hour old, so we're still going through it. But it's got to get its due diligence through the legislative process while we look at the measures more closely.
Respectfully, and in referencing what the municipalities and the provinces, that's what the Liberals have promised to do and sort of bypass now in this announcement today. The criticism of that approach when they first announced it was, I think sort of a common sense criticism, like if a province bans it, but like if Ontario doesn't ban it and Quebec bans it, what's to stop someone from purchasing a legal gun here and going over to Quebec? I don't, the borders between our provinces can be artificial in that sense. It's not like the border between the United States and Canada. And certainly when you reduce it down to the level of municipalities, to imagine Mississauga with a ban and Toronto without one, how does that actually have an impact?
Those criticisms are fair, and they actually echo what various groups have told me, like Police Souviant. I think one of the policies they have been fighting for is a restriction on the number of handguns in circulation in Canada. So I do think that Bill C-21 that was introduced today does reflect that. Because I would agree with my colleague, Mr. Brassard. We just completed a major study from the Public Safety Committee. And the importation of illegal handguns in Canada is a major problem. But the thing to remember is that violent gun crime in Canada is an extremely complex problem, and it cannot be solved with just simplistic things. So yes, tackling the illegal importation of handguns is an important thing, but our approach has to be multifaceted, and it can include things like tackling the number of guns that are in circulation, because there is also a problem from the diversion of legally owned handguns. Sometimes they are stolen from owners. Sometimes those owners themselves have used them in violent crimes themselves. There's also the poverty issue. We know that many social issues in our inner cities are the cause of violence. This is a very complex problem, and it's not just going to be legislation. It's not just going to be policy. It's going to be a whole host of measures that all have to work in tandem to effectively tackle the issue.
Mr. Brassard, I just have a last question for you. Just around, I guess, how your thesis and your party's thesis about focusing specifically on smuggling and what's happening at the border. I know that you acknowledge that the resources are one part of it. What, in addition, could the government do that would actually work to stop that?
Well, I do want to go back to what I said earlier, or what we were talking about earlier, and because to be fair, I think I deserve a chance to speak on that. That if a person commits a crime with a gun, then they vastly deserve to pay the price for that. There's no question about it. So I mean that I think most Canadians would agree with that. C5 doesn't address that. C5 actually minimizes the penalties for gun crimes, and it also minimizes penalties and leaves it to the discretion of a judge for the importation of guns. So I wanted to address that.
But that's with a whole host of other. I take your point on that. My point was just that that's on a whole host of other crimes as well, and the issue there is mandatory minimums. And mandatory minimums were found in a number of studies to have a disproportionate effect on certain communities. And I'm not saying that I'm not. I don't know if the government's decision is right there, especially when it comes to gun laws, because it certainly does seem a little bit odd when you think about the announcement they're making today. But I know that it's a suite of things. It's not just about gun owners.
No, and you're right. But I mean, there's been situations, Vasi. There was one a couple of weeks ago where somebody was arrested in Toronto. They were released within 48 hours and then committed a crime with a gun within 48 hours. So there's lots of this stuff that's happening across cities right across this country. But, you said before, what else can be done?
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with Mr. MacGregor, and that is, I have met with police officers. I have met with community leaders in Black communities, in other communities across this country who say the same thing, that the communities all have a responsibility, and the government has a responsibility to help those communities in dealing with the issue of crime, gun crime, et cetera. So it's not just an issue of dealing with illegal gun smuggling, although that's a big part of it, because many of those crimes, as I said, are being committed with illegally smuggled guns by gangs and criminals. But we also have to recognize, as Mr. MacGregor says, that there are a whole suite or host of other factors that are causing the inner city gun problem that is ravaging many of our major municipalities, including Vancouver, Toronto, and clearly in Montreal, because we saw just a couple of weeks ago somebody returning from a birthday party that was shot at in Laval. These things shouldn't be happening. But today's announcement, I fear, will do very little in dealing with the root cause of the problem: guns, gangs, illegal smuggling, criminal activity. That's where we need to focus. And the government has had 7 years to deal with this and 3 elections. And this is going to make a great headline. Whether it actually works or not, vastly remains to be seen. And, look, in our last election platform, we talked about supporting the resources of the CBSA, the RCMP, local police municipalities, local stakeholders and advocates in those communities to help solve this problem. And that's really what we need to focus on.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I just have 20 seconds left. I want to make sure Mr. MacGregor gets some time as well. Mr. MacGregor, last word to you.
I'd just say quickly on the mandatory minimums thing, it's important to remember that, judges need to have the ability to look at each case based on its own merits. And I have full faith that judges will apply the appropriate sentence for the appropriate crime. On this issue, as John said, it's incredibly complex. It's not just going to be solved by this one piece of legislation. I would encourage people to look at the comprehensive report that the Standing Committee on Public Safety released earlier this year. It contains a whole host of recommendations based on very wide witness testimony from law enforcement, from people involved in anti-gang programs, all the way to counselors and people who had formerly been gang members themselves. We produced that report and its recommendations in good faith that they would be acted upon by the government, and it will be following up to ensure that those are done so in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. I do appreciate both of you making the time for the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Vash.
Thank you.
John Brassard and Allastair MacGregor. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.